Welcome to Linguistically Aware, the podcast about all things linguistics. You are listening to CJSW 90.9 FM, broadcasting out of Calgary, Alberta, at the University of Calgary campus radio station, located on Treaty 7 land. I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. My name is Brooklyn Shepard, and I'm a PhD student in linguistics at the University of Calgary. In this conversation-based podcast, I sit down with linguists, or language experts, to talk about the ways language and linguistics interacts with our daily lives. In this episode, I sit down with Dr. Lindsay Hracs, the lead data scientist in the Kaplan Epidemiology lab here at the University of Calgary. Now, I know what you're thinking. Isn't this a linguistics podcast? Why are we talking about epidemiology? Well, Lindsay actually completed her PhD in linguistics here at U of C before joining the epidemiology lab. So in this interview, Lindsay tells us how she got from linguistics to epidemiology and what sorts of parallels there are in these two lines of research. Lindsay also tells us about some very exciting research going on in her lab and how her skills in linguistics played such a huge role. All right. Hi, Lindsay. First of all, I want to say thank you so much for coming in today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I know as a UCalgary alum, you started out in linguistics, and now you're working in the epidemiology lab here also at the University of Calgary. So I'm wondering if you could start off by telling us a bit about your academic background. So how you, what your academic background was in linguistics and sort of how you went from that to epidemiology.
Yeah, so I finished my PhD here in 2021, and my PhD research investigated language acquisition, and specifically input and exposure in language acquisition. And I was always I always really wanted to make the distinction between input and exposure because I don't think those are the same things. So I think of input as the thing that a learner needs to solve a learning problem, whereas exposure is like the measurable and observable properties of the learner's environment. And those things might be considered input, but I think of input as anything that the learner needs to solve a particular learning problem. I specifically looked at how children learn the word only, which is something that is a very, very complex thing. It's been studied extensively in laboratory settings, but I actually looked at a naturalistic approach to this, where I took child-directed speech and child-produced speech and essentially built a model of a learner essentially learning over time. And my research really wanted to look at whether learners were biased to certain types of information and whether these biases change over the course of development. And my hypothesis was that as a learner's grammar develops, so as they're learning language, what actually they need to solve the learning problem changes. And spoiler alert, that's exactly what I found. What's interesting, I think, about that is we see a lot of discrepancies in the lab research where we see learners doing all sorts of strange things, and when we have adult controls. So we see, children in a lab oftentimes like getting elicitations and things like that from them are difficult, and we expect some variability. But what's interesting is that there's a lot of variability in adult speech when we're talking about the word only. And it turns out that a lot of these things we're testing in the lab are not actually things people do that often. And so when I did my PhD research, I took this, I essentially created this corpus of utterances and fed it into a computer model and said, what does the child learn from this child-directed speech, and does it line up with what we see in the child-produced speech also in this corpus? And that's sort of in a nutshell, sort of what my PhD thesis was. And that actually seems quite a bit far from now being a data scientist who now studies global trends of inflammatory bowel disease. But my career as a data science really was more about how I got to where I am really had to do with understanding the things that a linguist is really good at. And in all honesty, I am where I am because of networking, which is something like I think most people roll their eyes at, nobody really wants to do. But you can kind of think of it as something different than, you're not just like handing out business cards and chatting and having those awkward conversations at conferences, but it's more about like selling yourself and being part of a community. And really, so what happened was when I was in the like sort of final months of my PhD, this lab that I'm now working in, they were working on a data visualization portal, which they made in R. So what I did in my PhD research is actually quite a bit different from being a data scientist who studies inflammatory bowel disease and the global trends of inflammatory bowel disease. But my career as a data scientist really kind of had to do more with being able to identify what linguists are good at, because we have a lot of transferable skills. And it's really just kind of like marketing yourself as somebody who has those skills. So I really got my job because I was networking, and I met a grad student. So my current lab manager was a grad student I met when we were both grad students, and they were working on this project in their lab that was building a data visualization dashboard in R, and they just got stuck with it. And the people in the lab just knew that I could code in R and I was fluent in R. And so they were like, we need to get this out for a paper. Can you help us? And so I got a little bit of casual work for them when I was sort of at the tail end of my PhD. And I kind of fixed this thing up pretty quick for them, sent it back, and they're like, oh, okay. And I got to learn a little bit about what they do. And I asked some questions about like, okay, well, you do a lot of these like document processing and summarization. I'm like, why are you doing this manually? And I was like, there's a lot of tools. We could write a script to do a lot of this work. And then I, kind of sat on it for a little bit. And then I emailed my contact at the lab and I said, do you think there's room for a postdoc who might actually help with this stuff? And within 2 minutes of me emailing, my now PI also was like, do you think Lindsay would be interested in doing a postdoc with us? And so I ended up doing a postdoc for just under 2 years with them. I actually never finished my postdoc project. It's a joke that postdocs in our lab, just because we have a lot of things and you come in and you get interested in something else. So there's this kind of joke where it's like about a 7-year average for you to finish your postdoc project because you're like, most people are no longer a postdoc, and they by the time they actually finish their project. But it was really, I kind of got there by networking and then realizing that I had some skills that I think that they could use. And so it was really, fast forward to 2024. I'm now the data science lead in that lab. I do a lot of analytical work in the area of machine learning. I work directly with another linguist in that lab, Dr. Joseph Windsor, who's the lab's knowledge translator. And then we work with epidemiologists. And so there's actually a pretty close ratio of linguist epidemiologists in our lab. But it turns out that linguists have a lot of skills that can be used outside of linguistics.
Interesting. Yeah. Oh man, I have so many questions, but we only have so much time. So I know, you talked a lot about your skills that you were sort of able to take from your academic background in linguistics, and I believe probably specifically the computational kind of modeling part, where you were quite fluent in programming languages such as R. And so that seemed to be like a skill that pretty quickly transferred to somewhere else. And so I'm wondering what other skills you found that maybe you weren't expecting that were useful to you in your current work, beyond what you've already talked about.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I think that surprised me the most was how much a linguist training in sort of manual data mining, so pattern recognition and things like that, like really just how useful that is outside of linguistics. So from the very initial stages of working with data in an introductory linguistics course, you're trained on pattern recognition. You're trained on analyzing data sets. So we look at data sets to identify repeating structures, looking at, when, are there exceptions to these structures, or is it just noise, those sorts of things. And that's literally from day one what you do in linguistics. And it turns out that that's an extremely useful skill anytime there's data. And so we really just have this ability to understand subtle properties in data that people without linguistics training, I think they just don't have. And I mean, I'm biased, I am a linguist, but I do think that we do, like, our training really just sets us up for being really good at that. We can look at something and be like, I think we should check this. And then we can go to like more automated things. And, when we have big data, we can be like, okay, well, how do we narrow down on those things that we're kind of seeing in the data? And I really do think that, as I said, linguists just sort of get this training from day one. And it's just something that I think I've realized I was really like, it was the data I loved. And it is linguistics. Linguistics data is where my heart is, but it's kind of like any data is a lot of fun. And so that was really just surprising how much of that transferred over. I think another thing, so when I was doing my PhD with Dr. Suzanne Carroll, I worked in the second language acquisition research lab with her, and we looked at visual information processing in second language learning. What's interesting about that is we were looking at how people used visual elements in a scene to sort of like help them learn vocabulary and learn sort of basic like verb, like very subject, verb, object sentences and things like that. But what's interesting about that is you get a really good sense about how people interpret visual elements. And that actually has translated to me being sort of like our data visualization specialist in the lab. So you get a sense of how people like chunk information or prioritize information or compare things visually. You get an idea of like how people use color, size, perspective, and all of those things actually matter in just like standard plots. And so it was surprising just how much of that translated over as well, because really what you want a data visualization to tell a good story, and you want it to like reduce cognitive load. So you want people to be able to really understand easily what you're trying to go with. And it turns out that, again, I just sort of had this surprising skill set from my work in the second language acquisition lab, where at the time I was creating experimental stimuli out of Pingu videos and Pingu images. I watched so much Pingu. And
that sounds like a dream job.
It was so really interesting about it because it was like, it is a very controlled visual scenario, but there's a lot of stuff happening in Pingu's world. Like there's a lot of stuff in the background, and it turns out that you can really can kind of create this whole little Pingu world where you're teaching language sort of around it, and it worked out really nicely. And yeah, surprisingly translated into doing a lot of data visualization in my current job, which is really like, when you think about like, it's just a different modality, right? When we're talking about linguistics, we're talking a lot of times about communication. We're talking about what do things mean? What do people understand from something, right? And it's really just sort of like, a lot of times, like, you can think of it as a different modality. And then recently, we've implemented a model that was really similar to the model I used in my PhD thesis. So in a really more specific case, our lead epidemiologist was looking at a study where she took data from, I think it was 9 different global regions. And she was like, well, I think I need to use a Bayesian analysis for this because there's a lot of different like heterogeneity among these data sets. What I want to do, I think there's a Bayesian component here. And I was like, oh, yeah, you know what? Like, you're looking kind of at how things change over time. That's very similar to like when you're looking at global trends of inflammatory bowel disease, it's very similar to like, the change in a child's grammar over time. Mm-hmm. And so we actually recently implemented in this inflammatory bowel disease epidemiology data, the model I did for my thesis, and it worked beautifully. And so it was just, again, one of those things where I was surprised to find that like this really could be applied outside of linguistics.
You're listening to Linguistically Aware, broadcasting on CJSW 90.9 FM on Treaty 7 Land. Listen to this episode or any other episode of Linguistically Aware in full at cjsw.com or Apple Podcasts. Just search Linguistically Aware. If you'd like to learn more about linguistics at the University of Calgary, be sure to visit our website, calgarylinguistics.ca.
Outside of just sort of the standard coding and machine learning things that I did get with that I did sort of had the opportunity to learn over the course of my PhD, there's a few surprising things where I'm like, oh, well, linguists have a lot of skills that we can put elsewhere. Yeah.
That's really cool. I really like your comment about the like data visualization as like a different modality. It made me think of like sound symbolism, but for colors and shapes and locations of things on graphs, and that's really cool.
Yeah.
And I'm also curious, just sort of out of as a quick side question, So you said that you had the opportunity to learn these skills throughout your PhD. Was most of that self-taught, like just through your own research that sort of led you through doing a Bayesian analysis or doing using R a lot or things like that? Or did you have any other kinds of formal training?
So I did I do have a little bit of a background in computer science as an undergrad. I did do some coursework, but it wasn't a minor or anything. It was just sort of a few courses here and there. I also was, even in high school, I was in advanced placement computer science.
Nerd.
Yeah, I know. So it's always sort of there. And so I feel like I was looking for an opportunity to integrate that into my thesis work, because I was like, I'm going to need a job one day. When I started my PhD, I wasn't sure if I was going to go the academic route or if I was going to go into industry. And so I really was trying to set myself up with trying to get as many skills as I could. So it really is, a lot of it was self-taught. My supervisor was very supportive of it. And she was also very much like, I don't know how to do this. You have to go figure it out because I can't teach you how to do this. And then one of the things I ended up doing was through a working group that I joined at the University of Calgary, I met Dr. John Aycock from computer science, and we kind of got to talking and then like emailing, and then all of a sudden Suzanne, my supervisor, was like, if you're going to keep bugging him, you should ask him to be on your committee. Yeah. And so it was again one of those things where it's really uncomfortable to sort of ask things of people and reach out to people, but it's just sometimes it's a really good thing to do, and it worked out really well that I ended up having a connection in computer science. And so, yeah, most of it was self-taught. The linguistics coursework in the stats course was sort of like where most of my R came from. I had a little bit before that. And then I ended up actually doing my PhD in Python. Most of the code I wrote was in Python.
Yeah.
And I really kind of got to think about programming languages in an interesting way, because I was switching between the two because I was doing a lot of data analysis in R, but I was coding my models up in Python. And I would do these things where I'm like, no, this code is 100% right. I'm certain this code is right. And then I'd be like, oh my goodness, that's the wrong language. And I would be doing these really interesting things where I'm like, am I bilingual in coding languages? And it was just something like, I'm a monolingual speaker with some second language, but it was one of those things where I was just like, am I experiencing something and so it was a really interesting problem to have, actually, where I'd be like, no, I'm certain it's correct. And then I'd be like, no, but this is Python and you're writing R code. It's not going to work.
Yeah. I do the exact same thing, actually, because my thesis, well, we can talk more about it after, but mine is also quite computational. And I also code my models up in, depending on the model, I usually use Python. But I do switch to R for like data visualization or, but sometimes not. Sometimes I use Python. It depends. I think it's just whatever I'm feeling that day, but I have the exact same problem. Yeah. And I've never thought of it like that, as like this sort of, like when I was growing up and I did French immersion, when I would come home, I would sometimes accidentally throw in a French word or something in my English as I'm speaking to my English-speaking parents or something. It feels like very, very similar to something like that. I like that. I really want to get into something very exciting that recently happened. Your recent article in Nature. So I know you mentioned Dr. Joseph Windsor as well, and I believe others, but Dr. Joseph Windsor is also a UC Calgary Linguistics alum. And both of you are on that paper, correct?
Yeah, so we co-first authored the paper.
That's awesome.
So it's a big accomplishment, but also to have two linguists co-first author an epidemiology paper in Nature. It
just shows you how far linguists can go.
Yeah.
how useful these skills are in all different walks of life.
Yep.
I'm wondering if you could just tell us a little bit more about what that paper was about. So like Nature is a very well-known journal and a very prestigious journal. But I'm wondering if you could tell us what it was about and why it was important.
So the article's titled The Global Evolution of Inflammatory Bowel Disease Across Epidemiologic Stages. And so there's a lot to unpack there for people that don't know what those words mean. But essentially we were looking at spatiotemporal trends, so things like across the globe and across time, and looking at how the epidemiology of inflammatory bowel disease changes. So what do I mean when I say epidemiology? What I'm talking about is really incidence and prevalence. So incidence is new diagnoses. So we think of those as the rate in which new cases come about, and we think of this as per a given population over a given time period. Prevalence is the existing cases in a population. So we think about when somebody has a new diagnosis of IBD, that's an incident case. Years down the road, they still have IBD. They're a prevalent case. They're in the population of people with IBD. And so we were looking at how these trends shift over time across the globe. And so what we did was we compiled a century's worth of published data through a systematic review. And so a systematic review is sort of a comprehensive compiling of all of the research that exists on a certain topic. And you essentially scour this with a research question in mind, and you say, does this study fit, with what I'm trying to answer with my research question, yes or no? And then once you've sort of screened the study, then you extract the data from it. And so we have essentially all of these incidence and prevalence values, so some numerical values that were published over the course of 100 years. And so we have a pretty decent-sized data set of all of this global data. At the point of publication, it was the most comprehensive data set for the incidence and prevalence of inflammatory bowel disease. And so what we were doing with this is kind of looking at how a global region transitions to a different stage. So we think of these stages, there's 4 stages. The first stage is emergence, and this is when incidence and prevalence are both really low, like kind of close to zero. So there's not a lot of new cases coming about and not a lot of existing cases in the population. And then stage 2 refers to, stage 2 is an acceleration in incidence. And what that means is new cases start to climb, but we just kind of see over the trend over time is still that existing cases are low. And then stage 3 is something called compounding prevalence. And this is actually when new cases start to sort of plateau or slow down a little bit, but the population is the prevalent population is actually getting quite a bit higher. And this is due to inflammatory bowel disease being a disease that's usually diagnosed either sort of pediatric, young adult, but it's usually diagnosed early. But it's a chronic disease with low mortality. So people usually live a full life with this disease. And so we see this really interesting trend happening where we see these stages throughout time because we have an aging IBD population. And then the fourth stage, which is theoretical at the moment, but it has to do with essentially the fact that there's aging people with inflammatory bowel disease that are now dying. Mm-hmm. And so they have, they're just dying of age-related issues, not necessarily inflammatory bowel disease. And so what we did was we took a machine learning classifier to sort of classify regions as one of these stages. So we took, we created a labeled data set with countries that had really robust longitudinal data. And then we took countries that didn't have these robust longitudinal data and started classifying them into this stage classification system. So we used the machine learning classifier to classify inflammatory bowel disease as stage 1, stage 2, or stage 3 in a given country. And so globally, we think of regions, we've sort of looked at this from the perspective of industrialization. So countries that were early industrialized, and we're thinking about countries that went through their industrial revolution pre-World War II. These are countries that we're now seeing as stage 3. So they have that sort of slowing down of new cases, but sort of quite a bit of an increase in the existing cases. We also see countries that are newly industrialized. So those are countries that their industrialization happens post-World War II, or countries that are emerging economies. So countries that haven't necessarily gone through an industrial revolution. And we're actually seeing those countries as stage 1 or 2. And so we can look at like a lot of these social things and kind of contextualize inflammatory bowel disease in that way. And so there's a lot of working parts to get us to this point, but what matters really is that understanding the epidemiology of inflammatory bowel disease allows healthcare systems to prepare for an increasing burden. So because it is a disease with really low mortality, it's an expensive disease. So it's an expensive disease to treat in terms of like medication, surgeries, so like the actual things that you can measure the costs of. But because people are also diagnosed usually in the early adulthood, there's a lot of indirect costs that go along with inflammatory bowel disease. Things like missing work, missing school, or maybe even caring for somebody that has inflammatory bowel disease. So we think of this as sort of the burden of inflammatory bowel disease. And I think that is an actual like appropriate word for this because it is something that is so costly for the healthcare system, but also really something that's can be debilitating and people really can miss a lot of work, school, and those sorts of things. So it's really an expensive disease to treat, and equitable access to treatments really can help mitigate that sort of indirect burden. And so it's really kind of the work is really important so that healthcare systems can say, hey, like we're a stage 1 country. We should expect that in the future, we're going to see a lot of inflammatory bowel disease. And the rate at which inflammatory bowel disease increases has to do with, there's a lot of things, again, a lot of working parts. A lot of times it has to do with healthcare infrastructure, just that healthcare infrastructure, you can, better infrastructure can help you better identify inflammatory bowel disease. But it also has to do with things like westernization. So as a Western diet becomes more adopted in a given country, you'll start to see inflammatory bowel disease cases increase. And so it is really something that is very predictable. And as countries see this, they can start to prepare the healthcare system for this rising burden of inflammatory bowel disease, just because it is something that's expensive to treat. The other thing is that our forecasting models also show that prevention is ambitious but achievable. So there are things you can do to mitigate the risk of inflammatory bowel disease. And so this work is sort of like really trying to push that idea of like, well, we know kind of where some countries are in the world. How can we make it so that countries who are transitioning through the earlier stages of the epidemiology, how do we sort of like reduce the burden on the healthcare system? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's sort of like in a nutshell what that paper is about.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Linguistically Aware. We hope you enjoyed our deep dive into the fascinating world of linguistics. If you'd like to learn more about linguistics, please visit our website, calgarylinguistics.ca. Until next time, keep exploring the beauty of language.